We are live.
Okay.
All right. Well, hello out there. For those of you who are watching today's special event, we are happy to have you. And we appreciate you joining us here to close out your Monday on a holiday week. We have today Drury University Special Collections Librarian and University Archivist Bill Garvin give a presentation. And before Bill dives in, I just want to remind you, if you're watching out there, you have a form in front of you on the page that you can fill out and put your name and ask a question. You can send that along and that will come to us at any time. If you actually want to ask another question, you can refresh your page and it will pop that back up for you. So just keep that in mind as we go through, and we'll welcome that, and we'll do a Q&A there at the end if you have questions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Bill Garvin.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. And thank you for those of you joining us. And today I'll be giving a short presentation on the history of Native American students at Drury. And if you give me just a minute, I've got a PowerPoint presentation that I want to put up on the screen here, so bear with me. Okay. So again, I want to talk a bit about the history of the students that, the Native American students that attended Drury in the early part of its history. And we're doing this, of course, in recognition of Native American Heritage Month. And let me stress at the beginning, though, that I am not an authority on Native American history or culture, but I'm speaking as someone who has studied the history of this institution. So what I'll be doing is talking about the group of Native American students who attended Drury for about the first 30 to 35 years of this institution's existence. And these students came from what was called at the time the Indian Territory, which was often abbreviated as the IT. We have a lot of documents in the archival collection that refer to students, and it will just say from the IT. And very briefly, the Indian Territory was formed in the 1830s as a relocation area, principally for Native American tribes from the southeastern United States. And these tribes, and sometimes in the history you see them referred to as the 5 civilized tribes, were mainly the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, and the Creek tribes. And they were forcibly relocated to the IT from about 1830 to about 1850. And I think most of us are familiar with the Trail of Tears, which we tend to think of as something that the Cherokee people endured, and they certainly did. But there were actually a series of these forced relocations over a period of years for all of these tribes. So there were actually a series of Trails of Tears. And there were about 100,000 Native Americans who were forced to relocate to the IT, and one source estimates that about 15,000 of them died during these forced relocation marches. And of course, the IT would become Oklahoma Territory in 1906 and would be admitted to the Union in 1907. So over the early period of Drury's history, we had about 200 students from the IT, the majority of which were Native American. Now, some were not. We had some students, say, who were the children of missionaries who came out of the IT who were not Native American, but most of these students were indeed Native American students. And it appears that most of these students, most of the Native American students who attended Drury were Choctaw Indians, but there were also Chickasaw and Cherokee students who attended. We may have had students who were Seminole or Creek Indians, but the institution did not identify any of these students by tribal heritage or affiliation. In the course of this presentation, I'll be showing you images and documents, most of which come out of our archival collection. And the first document I'd like to start with is a map. In the early years of Drury, the institution produced a number of promotional items that were used mainly either to recruit students or to solicit donations, particularly from donors on the East Coast up around New York and Boston. And it's noteworthy that the institution produced several maps for this purpose. And here's one of them. And as you can see, it's titled the Drury College Map of the Southwest. And this was produced, it's not dated, but we think it was produced about 1886. And I find it to be an interesting piece because in it, I think the institution is trying to convey two things. First of all, it's demonstrating the fact at the time that Drury was really the only institution of higher education in the area. And they actually state that in some of the other promotional materials. Particularly if you go westward, there's just really at this time, the founding, which is 1873, there's really no other educational institution, particularly of higher education in the area. It is also showing, I think, that it is an institution that is on the frontier. And indeed, there are early promotional documents that speak of the rawness of the area. So there's very much of a frontier feel that's expressed in these documents. It's interesting to juxtapose this map with another promotional publication that describes Drury's geographical location as central to the vast region west of the Mississippi, close to the heart of the continent, whence are to flow the issues of life to the ultimate America. And there's another document too that describes Drury as being located at the gateway to the vast empire of the West. So there's this expression of institutional mission that is really related to a sense of manifest destiny, of finishing the work of the frontier, of finishing up the business of forming the country. And the tone, it's really presented as a sort of an expression of patriotic, almost the mission is almost patriotic in nature, sort of patriotic mission that the school is fulfilling. I think that's fair to say. And while that is problematic, to say the least, to our sensibilities today, that was a prevailing sentiment among many people at the time. And by the way, we should note here, these lines you see on the map, these are obviously not roads, these are all railways. And one of the things that this wanted to emphasize is that Springfield is a rail hub and it's easy to get to by rail. At any rate, we need to appreciate that when Drury was founded, it was very much on the cusp of the frontier. And to put this into another context, it might be worth noting that when we held our first day of classes on September 25th, 1873, that was almost 3 years before George Armstrong Custer would look around at the little bighorn and realize that his bad day was about to get much worse. Well, speaking of our first day of classes, on that day, 39 students were in attendance, and 7 of them were Native Americans from the IT. Now, how did they get to Drury College? Why did they come here? One answer again is that for people in the IT, this was probably the closest institution to attend. Also, though, Drury had been founded by Congregationalist home missionaries, and there were Congregationalist missionaries working in the IT. And I suspect that they probably encouraged students to attend this new Congregationalist school in Springfield, Missouri. This particular image is actually the first day of classes in September 1874. So it is the second year that Drury was in operation. But if you look very closely, and it might be a little difficult for you to see, but down in the right-hand corner of this image, you can see a young man, and I believe this is a Native American student. You can see that it looks very young too, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. Well, we're very fortunate to have a fairly good photographic record of the early days of this institution. And when we look through these early images, we can sometimes see the faces of Native American students. This is a group portrait that was taken on the steps of Fairbanks Hall, which is an older building that's no longer, it was one of our first buildings, it's no longer extant on campus. But when you look at this group portrait down here in the first row here, you can see that this young man is Native American. And let's zoom in and take a look. And in some cases, we've been able to identify these students. This young man is Zachariah Carshall, who was Choctaw. We know that he attended Kimball Union Academy in New Hampshire, and then attended Drury College for 2 years. And this particular image is from 1895. After he left Drury, we know that he had a career as a teacher. He was a very successful farmer also. It said that he owned 1,000 acres of land in the IT. He was also, for many years, the county clerk of Sugarloaf County, Oklahoma. And here's another image, and again, this is a wonderful sort of dreamy, washed out image here. But if you look at the front row again, you can see this young man. And again, we've been able to identify him. His name was Taylor Frazee Crutchfield. We know he was Cherokee, and know that he attended Worcester Academy in Worcester, Ohio, and after that came to Drury and attended Drury for about 2 years. After he left Drury, he became a businessman in Veneta, Oklahoma, and owned an interest in a hardware company. Was a very successful businessman. Apparently very popular in Veneta, and apparently had a bright future ahead of him, got married, but unfortunately he contracted tuberculosis and died when he was just 26 years old. In many cases, of course, we cannot identify the students in these images. This is an early photo, very early photo that was taken at a bandstand that used to be on campus, which was a popular spot to have pictures taken. And if you look over to the left side of the image at these students, and then if we zoom in, we can see that a couple of these students are Native American. Now, these are obviously not college-age students. And sometimes that confuses people when they see images like this in our collection. And the explanation is that from its opening in 1873 until 1914, this institution was actually 2 institutions. There was Drury College proper, but there was also something called the Drury Academy, which was a preparatory school that prepared students for college level studies, for a college level course of study. And these students are obviously younger academy students. Well, if there's an image that is emblematic of this chapter in our history, it is this group portrait. This photograph was taken during the 1894-1895 academic year, and it is entitled on the back in a contemporary hand. It's entitled The Indian Boys of Fairbanks Hall, 94-95. We know we've identified all of these young men except for one. And by the way, again, here is Zachariah Carshall. And this young man over here is named Merritt Eaton, who is Cherokee. And I'll be talking about his sister in some detail in just a minute. You'll notice too that some of these young men are wearing uniforms. Drury did have a cadet corps until about 1919, 1920, a little bit after the First World War. There's a very interesting story related to this young man here, and his name was Noel Gardner. And he would be killed a matter of months after this image was made. Noel Gardner came from a prominent Choctaw family, and in fact was the nephew of the chief of the Choctaw Nation at the time. And he was home over the summer of 1895, and he and a young woman named Durant fell in love and became engaged. But the young woman's family disapproved of the match and planned to send her away to stay with a relative in a distant part of the territory in an effort to keep the couple apart. So he and his fiance, Noel Gardner, and this young woman, again, Durant was the family name, they decided to elope. So on July 2nd, 1895, Gardner and a friend, a boy named Cephas Garvin, no relation to me, as near as I can tell. Gardner and Garvin rode over to her home under the cover of darkness. They did this at night. And they brought along with them a saddled pony for the young woman. The young woman secretly crept out of her house, met her fiance and his friend, and they rode off to get married. Somehow, though, the young woman's brother, a man named Rudolph Durant, found out that she had left. He armed himself, he mounted a horse and pursued them. And when he caught up with them, the accounts say that what he did was sort of circled around in front of them and lay in wait, ambushed them with a Winchester rifle, and killed Noel Gardner and Cephas Garvin. And Gardner was just 19 years old. So it's this very poignant sort of frontier Romeo and Juliet tragedy, a very interesting story. Well, moving on to happier topics, I'd like to talk about a few of our Native American students who went on to make significant contributions in their communities and beyond. And the first person I'd like to talk about is Dr. Rachel Caroline Eaton. And again, we saw her brother in that group portrait a couple of slides back. She was Cherokee, and in fact, her grandmother had walked the Trail of Tears. And Eaton was at Drury for about 7 years, from 1889 until 1896. She first attended the academy and then entered Drury College, graduating with a bachelor's degree in science in 1895. She stayed for a year longer as a graduate student, but then went on to the University of Chicago, where she earned a master's degree and then a PhD in English literature. She is believed to be the first Indian woman from Oklahoma to have earned a PhD. She was a teacher and a school superintendent. She wrote extensively on Cherokee history and culture. And in 1936, she was inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. Now, there's a website called All Things Cherokee, And the entry on Dr. Eaton includes this image, and it shows her at study here at Drury, at her desk at study, but apparently here at Drury College. And you'll forgive me for going all sort of uber archivist here, but I noticed as I looked at this image, I noticed that on the bookshelf here next to her desk, you can see there's a portrait of a man, but there's also this group portrait, this photograph, and I could see it well enough, particularly these sort of white things in the foreground here. I could see it well enough to tell that it was an image that looked familiar to me, so I dug around in our old photographs and archives, and sure enough, found the image. This image was taken in 1893. It's the sophomore class. It's a little difficult to see, but this young man here has his leg stuck out, and if you look on the bottom of his foot is written SOPH, soft. So these are the sophomores, and this is Rachel Carroll Eaton right here as a sophomore in 1893. Victor Locke Jr., who attended the Drury Academy from 1895 to 1896, would go on to become the principal chief of the Choctaw Nation from 1910 to 1918. He also served as the Choctaw representative to the President of the United States. And finally, Peter James Hudson, who was a very important figure in Choctaw history, particularly because of the work that he did in preserving the history, culture, and language of the Choctaw. He was born in 1861, and his uncle, George Hudson, had been the chief of the Choctaw Nation. And as a young man, the Choctaw Tribal Council recognized that he showed intellectual promise. And in 1879, they sent him off to school. And according to a story passed down in his family, Hudson, accompanied by a tribal elder, went to the train station and asked the station master where a good school was. The station master was familiar with Drury College and put Hudson on a train to Springfield. He started in the academy in 1879 and graduated from Drury College with a bachelor's degree in classical studies in 1887. And we have a very good photographic record of him. Here he is, again, the stairway of Fairbanks Hall was a favorite place for students to have group portraits taken. And here he is in a group portrait taken in 1885. This is him over here on the right, and I've enlarged that, and you can see he's looking very good in a straw boater. Several of the young men appear to be wearing these straw hats. And here's another group portrait that was taken in the following year in 1886. And again, he's roughly in the same position over here, standing on the right there. And after graduating, Hudson attended Hartford Seminary and then returned to the Indian Territory, where he worked as the headmaster of the Tuskahoma Female Academy. He also served as a Presbyterian circuit minister, and he was a circuit minister in the original sense of the term, riding a horse from congregation to congregation. And contrary to what we might think, this work was not without its hazards. On one occasion, lightning struck and killed his horse. Another time, he and his horse were mauled by a panther. He later worked as a Choctaw interpreter for the Department of the Interior, and like Victor Locke, was also served as the Choctaw representative to the President of the United States. Um, we know that Hudson had been a proponent of assimilation, but despite this, he realized that Choctaw language, history, and folklore were rapidly disappearing during this period. Particularly in the second half of his life, he really set to work to translate and record as much of the Choctaw oral tradition, history, and folklore as he could. And in his day, he was regarded as the preeminent scholar of Choctaw culture. He recorded all sorts of things. Again, language, food, information, traditions about food, all sorts of cultural practices. Some of this information is pretty easy to find out on the internet. But by the time of his death in 1938, he was deeply respected not only by the Choctaw people, but by many people in Oklahoma. He was a very well-known figure. And an obituary in the Chronicles of Oklahoma said of him, "No living translator of the Chickasaw and Choctaw languages survives who can approximate him. He was the best informed of the surviving remnant of Choctaws on the details of Choctaw history, legislation, government, and Indian lore." And what's ironic about this is that Hudson, who had dedicated much of his life to the preservation of Choctaw history and tradition, had at one time believed that Choctaw children should be taught to speak English and only English. I mean, that's a very common thing you find often in immigrant families too, this belief that you want your children to assimilate, and in order to do that, you do not want them to learn their native language. And he very much believed that. Although in 1998, I had the honor of meeting two of his grandsons who came over for the 125th anniversary of Drury. And they told me, one of the things they told me about him was that shortly before his death, Peter Hudson had told them the greatest regret of his life was that he had not taught his children and his grandchildren the Choctaw language. Well, to conclude, the number of Native American students who attended Drury tapers off in the early 20th century. Really about between 1905 and 1910, we see a really steep drop off. And it appears that what might have happened was that institutions that were specifically founded for Native American students began to appear in the area and may have attracted those students. Specifically, there was Bacone College, which was founded in 1880 as the Indian University was its original title. It's still in existence today and is located in Muskogee. And then also Haskell Indian Nations University, which was originally started as a trade and prep school, but then developed into a institution of higher education. It was founded in 1884 in Lawrence, Kansas, and other institutions began to appear, and it's probable that there were institutions that were closer for these students, and so they began to attend those schools. So, all right, that's the conclusion of my presentation, and if anyone has any questions, I'd certainly be happy to try to answer those.
All right. Hey, Bill. Thank you for
Yes.
that. That was really interesting. We have a couple of questions coming in, and one is from Charlene Ingerson. If it were still standing, where would Fairbanks Hall be located on Drury's campus today, and why was it demolished?
Let me go ahead and stop the share here. Well, thanks for the question. Right, there's actually a marker over between Old Lay Hall, which is now the Education Building, of course, and Clara Thompson. So right between there, you see a marker, and it's funny because the marker makes reference to the nickname that was given to Fairbanks Hall, and it was called the Barn. It was partially an academic building with classrooms, but it was also a residence hall. It was originally built as a ladies' residence hall, but later became a boys' dormitory. And the young men who lived there used to refer to themselves as triple Bs, the better boys of the barn. It was the second building that was built here, and I believe it was erected about 1875, 76, and it was built to be impressive, and it was an impressive building. It was 3 stories. It had a big mansard roof, but like a lot of old buildings, it was very difficult to maintain, and it didn't survive the 1970s. When the sort of thing to do back then was to tear down old buildings, and what was done first to it was that that beautiful mansard roof was taken off, and it was made a flat roof building. So it's unfortunate they sort of decapitated the building, and then I think about 1979 or so it was razed. It was taken down, and it's a terrible loss, but I think many campuses have sad stories like that about buildings they wish they'd been able to hold on to and didn't, particularly in the 1970s.
Interesting. Okay, here's another one from Aaron Jones. Bill, do you have a rough estimate of how many of the students that came to Drury from the IT, of how many students came to Drury from the IT by their tribe of origin?
No, I mean, we know that there were about 200 students that came from the IT, and as I said, the institution didn't record their tribal affiliation, or I don't have any. I've never seen any records that record their tribal affiliation. Occasionally on photographs, it will just in parentheses afterwards say Indian. The tribal affiliation I picked up mainly from material that was written about these students afterwards, particularly obituaries, that sort of thing. And the majority of them seem to be Choctaws. We don't really have a reliable breakdown because that really wasn't recorded. But we know from what I've been able to see, the majority of them seem to be Choctaws.
We have a couple of questions here now from Michael Verney, and the first is, can you please clarify the supposed Indian mounds on campus for everyone?
Right, okay. Yeah, there are a couple of campus legends. They're kind of like urban legends, and any institution worth its salt has legends, some of which are based in fact and some of which are not. There's a marker over by the tennis courts that was erected, I think, in the 1930s by the University Club that speaks of the Indian mounds. And there, by the tennis courts, there are some sort of low mound-like features there. And an early professor here, Dr. Shepard, said that these were mounds that were the bases of sort of hutments in houses, essentially, for the Osage, I believe he said. And that's on the basis of his statement, and he was a very well-respected geologist and historian in the area. But on the basis of that statement, the University Club put that marker up. And by the way, there's also the marker in front of Burnham Circle that marks the Civil War trench. So there were a series of these markers that were put up in the area. In the 1970s, the decision was made to expand the tennis courts. And because the expansion of those, the tennis courts was going to encroach upon those mounds, there was, I think, there was a federally mandated archaeological survey that had to take place. And so Drury contacted some people over at Missouri State University, what was in SMSU, to come over and conduct that survey to check for any artifacts or anything. And we do have the report here in archives, which I'd be happy to share with you. But unfortunately, what that survey discovered was that there was no evidence of any Native American habitation, or they didn't find any artifacts. And their conclusion was, unfortunately, that these were only normal geological formations. So, I've had people say, well, shouldn't we remove the marker? But and I know it is confusing for people because there's an insistence that, well, there must have been something there. I've had students come to me too and say, well, we understand that there's an Indian burial ground under Sunderland Hall. Absolutely, there's absolutely no evidence of that. So that's the story behind the marker.
So maybe it's kind of like before the internet, people might have said, if there's a historical marker there, it must be true.
It's got to be true. There's a marker there. So yeah.
So here's the second question from Dr. Verney, and that is a really good one. Do we know how these Native American students were received at Drury or in Springfield generally?
I've not seen anything directly written about that. There's an early history of the college written by Paul Roulet, who was one of the first faculty members who wrote about 1900, he wrote a typescript history. It's a really valuable and interesting document about the early days of the school. And I mean, the only thing that's really said in there was that he talks about, it might not be his history. It might be a little addenda at the end. That's a narrative written by someone who remembers the first day of school. And they talk about, 7 dusky students walking into the academy building on the first day. And, which to, of course, to our eyes today is problematic. There's also, I think, what's sort of interesting. Again, I've not read any sort of account or any sort of personal narrative where people talk about their attitudes towards these students. I think it is interesting, as I mentioned, that some photographs will say that we'll list the people in a group portrait after the person's name. And of course, these students were, assimilated and had, Europeanized names. After their names, very often it will have in parentheses afterwards, Indian. And so, I mean, the only thing I've been able to conclude from that is there was a sense of them being seen as something different, the other. And I look at some of these images too, and this is probably purely a prejudicial interpretation on my part, but I just think it had to be difficult to be a person who was so different from the other students. And again, this is pure speculation. I have to emphasize this, that I wonder if that might be why in the early part of the 20th century, when Native American schools began to open up, that these students went away, that, at the very least, that they felt sort of felt out of place, or maybe not necessarily not welcomed, but it's obvious that they were sort of viewed as something different. Again, the other in this by some of the information I've seen. But Um, I have not yet found any sort of document where a student describes what their attitudes towards these students were. Peter Hudson, it's interesting. Peter Hudson spoke at graduation. He delivered an address, and so I think it's remarkable in a way that frankly, at the time, that these students were admitted at all. And so there was a progressivism that I think was emblematic of the Congregationalist church that allowed these students to come in.
And I had wondered on that same note, is there any indication that Drury, sort of recruited these students, such as recruiting looked like in those days? Did they go out and proactively to the IT and try to drum up people to come and fill seats?
I think that was done, as I indicated. I think that was done through the sort of Congregationalist network. There were it's interesting that when the school was founded here in Springfield, when the faculty were recruited, one of the things that the first president wanted was he did not want faculty to all be Congregationalist. He wanted faculty of different denominations, okay? And that wasn't so much because he had this ecumenical spirit, but because he wanted somebody to go to the Presbyterian church, somebody to go to the Baptist church, somebody to go to the Methodist church and speak on behalf. I have seen references to faculty speaking at their churches about this enterprise, Drury College, and they're trying to do two things. They're trying to raise money, obviously. That was always a concern, particularly in the early days of the school. And they're also recruiting students. And I suspect that the Congregationalist missionaries out in the IT were encouraged to send students to Drury.
We have a question here too from Cheyenne Hebner, and she asks, how big of a deal was assimilation here at Drury? You touched on it briefly. Curious if there's more information about that.
Yeah, I know, for example, Haskell, and I don't know a lot about it, so I need to be a little bit careful of what I say, but Haskell, what is now Haskell University, when it was first opened up as a trade school, my understanding is they were bringing students in from some of the tribes further west and some of the tribes say from the Dakotas, and that there are stories there about those students being forced to assimilate, and being punished, that sort of thing. I think the students that were coming out, and I don't know a lot about this, but the students that were coming out of the IT, I think to a great degree, had been sort of assimilated into Western or European culture. So I don't think there was an effort a conscious effort to assimilate these students, simply because I think that assimilation had sort of already occurred. But I've not seen any document in the collection that where the institution is talking about Europeanizing students or anything. It's nothing like that.
All right, well, Bill, that's all the questions that we have. So thanks for putting this together, and thanks for your time. It was really interesting and nice way to spend the afternoon here.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. And again, those of you who are on campus, if you have questions or want to have a look at some of these documents, please give me a holler or come by and see me.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you later. Have a great Thanksgiving. Bye.